This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Check out Squarespace through the link in the description below. More on them in a bit. Since the dawn of civilization, man has striven to do things that he wasn't supposed to do. Not supposed to be able to see in the dark, man harnessed the power of fire. Not supposed to be able to cross oceans, man built ships. Not supposed to be able to fly, man invented airplanes. And when we found the tallest mountain nestled in one of the most remote places imaginable, there were men who felt the urge to climb to the top of it, despite our bodies clearly not being designed to do so. Today, Mount Everest is visited by more people than ever before, people willing to spend tens of thousands of dollars for a chance to climb to the top. But this is hardly a trip to Yellowstone we're talking about here. The mountain is a killer. There are a dozen different ways to die on the slopes of Everest. The bodies of dead climbers left behind on the mountain for others to pass by are a grisly reminder of this. But is it worth it to brave the dangers to have the chance to stand on the roof of the world? Judging by how crowded the slopes of Everest are in a typical climbing season, some people certainly think so. As interesting as Everest is, its name is certainly uninspiring. It was named by Andrew Scott Waugh, the Surveyor General of India, in 1856 after Sir George Everest. He was Waugh's predecessor and mentor. Everest himself didn't want the mountain named for him. He wanted to keep to the traditional names used by the Nepalese and Tibetan peoples native to the area, as was done with other Himalayan mountains. But finding a commonly used name was difficult, not least of which because both Nepal and Tibet refused to allow Westerners into their country. So Mount Everest stuck, even though the Nepalese name for the mountain, Sagarmatha, meaning goddess of the sky, is actually a lot more interesting. Mount Everest stands 29,020 feet high, straddling the border between Nepal and Chinese-controlled Tibet. The border between the two countries actually crosses over the summit of the mountain. The mountain is so tall that the top of it juts into the stratosphere, exposing it to the howling winds of the jet stream. This contributes to the frigid temperature on the mountain, an average of minus 17 degrees Fahrenheit, dropping to minus 30 in winter. So what exactly is so dangerous about Mount Everest anyway? The truth is, there are so many dangers that we have to work our way from the bottom of the mountain to the summit in listing them off, much like a mountain climber. In fact, let's pretend that you're one of the thousands that flock to Everest every year in order to climb it. If you're anything like us, you probably have limited mountaineering experience and even less high-altitude climbing experience, which is an entirely different animal. The most common place to ascend is on the Nepalese side of the mountain, so that's mostly what we're going to be describing. Your journey begins by flying into the capital city, Kathmandu, and from there taking a short hop to the small town of Lukla. But from there, most conveniences of modern civilization end, and you're going to be walking the rest of the way. It takes about a week for you to hike to Everest Base Camp. This is a necessary step in the process of climbing the mountain because it climatizes you to the high altitude. A person that has lived their lives at mostly low altitudes can run into a lot of health problems when climbing, the most serious of which is altitude sickness. If someone were to invent a transporter and zap you from sea level to Mount Everest instantaneously, most likely you'd pass out within a few minutes because your body isn't used to how little oxygen there is in the air. The most serious form of altitude sickness is high-altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE, where your lungs malfunction so badly that fluid fills them up, and if it's left untreated, it will kill you quite quickly. After your journey, your new home is Everest Base Camp, a massive tent city situated at 17,700 feet. This is where all expeditions from this side of Everest begin. Climbers will spend several weeks here, further acclimatizing to the altitude, while Sherpas are busy preparing the route ahead for the upcoming climbing season. So, who are the Sherpas? Well, they're indigenous people to the area who've spent hundreds of years living in the Himalayas, thus well acclimated to the altitude. They have become invaluable to Everest expeditions, being hired out as climbing guides, porters, and for other manual labor tasks. For people who live in one of the most impoverished countries in the world, Western tourism money can be a lucrative living, but unfortunately, it also comes at a high price. A third of the people who've died on Everest have been Sherpas. Even at base camp, things aren't exactly safe. The tent city is still vulnerable to the whims of Mother Nature. On April the 25th, 2015, a massive 7.8 magnitude earthquake rocked Nepal, killing around 9,000 people and causing $10 billion in damages. 150 miles away from the epicenter, the quake started an avalanche that completely flattened base camp on Everest, killing 22 climbers and injuring over 60. Avalanches are insidious. Assuming you aren't killed by an object that hits you during the event, or you don't get swept off a cliff and fall to your death, you can find yourself completely buried in snow. And not snow like you played in as a kid either. Once the snow settles, it compresses into the consistency of concrete, making it hard to dig through. If you don't suffocate, you might just live long enough to freeze to death while awaiting rescue. Assuming there are no avalanches to kill you at base camp, after a couple of weeks of rest, you're ready to continue. At the bottom of Mount Everest is the Khumbu Glacier, a slow-moving river of ice that travels an estimated 4 feet a day. At the top of the glacier is the Khumbu Icefall, where the ice drops off a slope to the glacier below. The icefall is one of the most treacherous sections of the mountain. Huge blocks of ice the size of houses can collapse or tumble down without warning, and yawning crevices or cracks in the ice can form suddenly, swallowing anyone unlucky enough to be standing there at the time. In 2014, a sudden avalanche of ice cascaded down the icefall, killing 16 climbers. Once you make it through the icefall, you stop at Camp 1, the first of 4 camps situated on Everest, to provide rest and acclimatization to climbers. Climbers will generally spend several days traversing the icefall back and forth between base camp and Camp 1 to build up their stamina and get their lungs used to the altitude before continuing upwards to Camp 2, also called Advanced Base Camp. And just before we continue with today's video, I want to take a quick moment to tell you about today's sponsor, Squarespace. Now, a couple of simple things. Maybe you've got an idea for a website or a business or podcast, something like that, in your mind, and you're thinking, ooh, maybe I should start that. Well, 2, the only way to figure out whether that's something, a business, a podcast, whatever that people want, is to get it out there into the world. And I know this can be a bit daunting because it's always scary to go and try new things, but not knowing how to set up a website and getting your idea out there to the world is not an excuse. There are no excuses available with Squarespace. Squarespace allows you to create a powerful website for whatever you're up to. You want to sell something online? Yes, set up a store with Squarespace. Or maybe you want to do a podcast. Well, you can also do that on Squarespace. Now, it all starts on Squarespace with a beautiful template that you can customize to your heart's content, or start from scratch, or move over from an existing domain. But, just stick with the templates. It's easier. Like I said, don't make excuses. And once you've gone through the super easy customization process, there's no updates, there's no patches, there's no tech BS to deal with. No one likes any of that stuff. And Squarespace also handles all of the website-y stuff. Like I say, they do podcasts, but they also do mailing lists, social integrations, and much more. Like I say, Squarespace removes the excuses to your dreams. So just go get started now. Also 24/7 customer support if you have a question. So head to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And let's get back to it. From a technical standpoint, Everest is not a hard mountain to climb. The routes to the summit are well established, and prep work like fixing ropes and ladders to sections that require them is done in advance by teams of Sherpas to make things easier for the following climbers. This is probably why so many mountaineering novices attempt it in the first place. So there aren't actually as many deaths from falling on Everest as there might be on other mountains, but it still does happen occasionally, either through equipment malfunctions or human error. This increases in likelihood the higher up the mountain you go. Once climbers reach Camp 4 at 26,000 feet, they've crossed into the death zone, the altitude at which there is simply not enough breathable oxygen in the atmosphere to support life. Most climbers use oxygen masks at this height because while it is possible to go without it, the truth is that you are slowly suffocating the entire time you're there. A lack of oxygen to your brain is called hypoxia, and it impairs your judgment and rational thinking skills. Sufferers describe the feeling as similar to being drunk. At this altitude, any mistake can be fatal. Everything is working against you, from the tricky terrain to the bitter cold and howling wind. The lack of oxygen in the air only compounds the problems. If something happens to you, anything from altitude sickness, an accidental fall, frostbite, hypothermia, or even an ordinary heart attack, rescue is difficult, if not impossible. Until recently, helicopters couldn't fly high enough onto Everest to rescue climbers in distress, and even with today's modern technology, few pilots are willing to risk it, as the weather around Everest is notoriously unpredictable. Even worse, other climbers will probably be unable to help you, as they would lack the energy to do anything but keep themselves moving. Lowering someone down a mountain on ropes is difficult and dangerous at the best of times, and doing it in the death zone risks the lives of everyone. So there is often no choice but to leave the stricken climbers to die. And of course, because recovering a dead body at that altitude presents many of the same problems as rescuing someone alive but not able to climb themselves, most of the time the bodies are left where they lay or are covered by rocks in a rough funeral cairn. The top of Mount Everest is littered with such corpses, some of which have been there for almost 100 years, protected from decay by the frigid temperatures and often serving as landmarks for other climbers. One area strewn with bodies dressed in brightly colored climbing gear is known as Rainbow Valley. In order to make an attempt to summit Everest, all conditions have to be perfect. You have to have a window of good weather, which is by no means guaranteed. It's entirely possible to spend a month on Everest and end up stuck at Camp 4 without even being able to make an attempt because of bad weather or high winds. All your equipment and your body have to be in perfect working order. And most important of all, you need to have an impeccable sense of timing. An assault on the peak of Everest is structured like a military mission. And like a military mission, if anything goes wrong, people can and will die. If the conditions are right, you can leave Camp 4 at a precise time. You are breathing supplemental oxygen, but you only have a finite amount of gas, and you don't want to be descending the mountain in the dark when the temperatures can drop down to 40 degrees below zero. Because of all that, you are given a strict turnaround time. If you don't make it to the top by a certain time, no matter how close you are, you must turn around and return to Camp 4. Imagine being only a couple of 100 feet from the top and having to turn around. You would certainly be reluctant, but continuing on past the turnaround time puts you in danger in an already dangerous environment. These lessons were learned the hard way in one of the most famous mountaineering disasters of modern times. On May 10, 1996, a large group of climbers set out on their summit push. They were members of two guided climbing expeditions, Adventure Consultants and Mountain Madness. This was at the start of Everest's commercial era, where clients would pay fees in the tens of thousands to hire professional climbing guides to escort them up the mountain. On this day, 34 climbers were attempting to summit Everest. At the time, this was the most in a single day to try for the summit. The group was slowed down by several factors. The ropes that were supposed to be fixed ahead of time to help climbers up the steeper parts weren't in place, forcing a delay while the task was completed. The amount of climbers on the mountain contributed to the bottlenecks and was compounded by the fact that only one rope was fixed, forcing people climbing up the mountain and people descending down the mountain to alternate using it. But the worst delay of all was caused by the summit itself. There isn't much on the summit of Everest. It's not very big, about the size of a large dining room table. Buddhist prayer flags are strung across it, along with other offerings left by summiters over the years. There certainly isn't a gift shop. Other than admiring the view from the roof of the world, there's not much to do. But if you had just spent a month climbing a mountain and reached the top, fulfilling what for many climbers is a lifelong dream, you certainly aren't going to get up there, take a quick look around, and immediately head back down. They say that climbers who summit Everest feel an intense rush of euphoria, almost as though the mountain itself is rewarding them for braving the dangers to make the pilgrimage. Most likely, it's a combination of an endorphin rush mixed with a lower than usual oxygen count in the bloodstream, but the idea is still romantic. The clients of Adventure Consultants and Mountain Madness certainly felt that euphoria, sticking around on the summit long after they should have descended. In fact, everyone who summited that day did so after the agreed-upon 1 p.m. turnaround time. Competition between the two groups probably played a role in this, as well as the fact that when you have paying customers, you try to get them their money's worth. But when the climbers descended, they ran into a storm that they wouldn't have been exposed to if they had stuck to their turnaround time. Wind gusts of up to 80 miles an hour buffeted them dropping the temperature to 60 below. By now, they had all run out of supplemental oxygen and were suffering from the effects of hypoxia. And the rush of snow and clouds completely blinded them, and they lost all sense of orientation. By the time it was over, 5 climbers from the group were dead, including the leaders of both guided expedition teams. On the north side of the mountain, another group of 3 climbers from the Indo-Tibetan Border Police were caught in the storm, and they were also killed, bringing the death toll to 8. It was the deadliest day in history at the top of Everest. One of the climbers on the adventure consultants team, John Krakauer, was a reporter on assignment for Outside Magazine and witnessed the tragedy firsthand. He wrote a book about the experience called Into Thin Air that became a bestseller and exposed the public at large to the bizarre and dangerous world of high-altitude mountaineering. Rather than deter would-be climbers, the 1996 Everest disaster seemed to trigger an explosion in popularity for tackling Everest. Every year since then, the amount of climbers applying for permits from the Nepalese and Chinese governments has gone up, and base camp gets more and more crowded every year. This overcrowding has led to a number of unpleasant problems. Garbage, including empty food packages, spent oxygen bottles, broken climbing gear, and more is simply left behind by careless campers, forcing entire expeditions to be mounted simply to clean up the trash. Even more disgusting to think about is the estimated 26,000 pounds of human waste left behind on Everest at the end of a climbing season. Public bathrooms are something found in civilization, not in one of the most inhospitable places on the planet. And while lessons have been learned from the 1996 disaster, climbers are still killed every year on Everest, in many cases their bodies joining the cadre of frozen corpses already scattered all over the death zone. But it is perhaps this danger that draws people to Everest in the first place. Few other places offer the opportunity to test yourself against the worst that Mother Nature has to offer, while providing a great story to tell your grandchildren and one of the world's most spectacular views. And this being the modern age, well, it's a perfect place for a selfie. Mount Everest isn't for the faint-hearted, but for those who brave its slopes, it is a rite of passage, a chance to push yourself past all known limits to find out what you are truly capable of. As Edmund Hillary, who in 1953 was one of the first 2 people to summit Everest, said, "It is not the mountain we conquer, but ourselves." Despite that romantic notion, the mountain still claims its deadly harvest of unfortunate climbers every year. For every 100 people who summit Everest, 4 will die, which is why Mount Everest will probably forever be the world's deadliest tourist attraction. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe. Brand new videos just like this a couple of times a week. Also, do support this channel by supporting our fantastic sponsor Squarespace, link to them below. And thank you for watching.